Have you ever found yourself in a situation where it seems as though God is acting too slow, in carrying out those good plans that He has for you? And at times you're tempted to want to rush in. I mean, look at some of those scriptures like Jeremiah 29:11 that says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declare the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." You look at those plans, the plans to be financially stable, to be married and have your own kids, to have a successful business, and the list goes on. And sometimes, if not many times, you're tempted to just want to help God, to get things moving, especially when you start comparing yourself to others, consciously or unconsciously. Well, unconsciously most of the time. I know you can relate. My name is ernestunde, and you're welcome once again to my series titled The Christian Walk. It's a series that shares insight for a productive Christian walk. Now today we're talking about God's time. Now it's a two-part message. The first part, we're going to be talking about the consequences of not waiting for God's time. And then the second part, which is next week, we're going to be talking about the benefit of waiting patiently for God. So today we'll be talking about the consequences of not waiting for God's time. Please don't go away, and we'll be right back. It's always a bad idea to try to accomplish God's plan in our own way or in our own timing, because God's plan comes complete with His own timing and His own method. And when we try to tinker with it, practically everything goes wrong most of the time. Now we'll be looking at some examples from the scripture just to give perspective. We're going to start with our father Abraham, our father of faith, but who at some point tried to speed up the process. Now in Genesis 15:1-7, God promised Abraham a son, promised him a big family, land, and several other things, and Abraham believed him, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Why? Because he believed without seeing, and he was 75 years old at that point. Now let's fast track 10 years later, when he was about 85 years. The scripture tells us that as at that age, God has still not blessed him with the son that He promised. And so we see Abraham at this point in time trying to help the process by listening to his very depressed wife, Sarah. Now in Genesis 16, it tells us that Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no son, but she had an Egyptian slave called Hagar. And so she thought to herself, maybe Abraham could sleep with Hagar and God can raise a family for her through her. And so she shared the idea with Abraham, and it sounded good to Abraham. At least the idea was from Sarah, it wasn't from him. And so he went along with Sarah's plan, and so after 10 years, after seeing Canaan and nothing has happened, Abraham took Hagar, Sarah's slave, slept with her, and she conceived. Now the scripture told us that after she conceived, when she realized that she had conceived and she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, Sarah. And so it got to Sarah that she was disrespecting her, and so she in turn turned to Abraham and accused him. See, you're responsible for this wrong that I'm suffering, that my slave is now disrespecting me because she's pregnant. And said, I'll leave it between you and God. May God judge between you and I. Basically saying that God punish you. Now, by nature, as human beings, we are always looking for shortcuts, loopholes that we can take advantage of. We're taking advantage of the system. And so we see Abraham and Sarah being caught up in this situation also. They're trying to take advantage of a loophole they seem to see in God's message to Abraham. Now, we need to realize that a lot of times, God gives us the facts about the plans He has for us, but He doesn't give us the details. And He does so for a reason, because He expects that we should trust Him. We are His children, and we should trust Him. But a lot of times, we see ourselves trying to fill in the gaps, trying to help ourselves. And I know we can relate, because we feel God seems too slow. And so Abraham and Sarah at this point found themselves in that situation. And Sarah, assuming that she was barren, so came up with an alternative solution to help God's plan. And that is usually the problem. when we come up with our own alternative solution. Now, God had promised Abraham a son. Sarah knew that Abraham was looking forward to a son and was growing old. And maybe he perceived that Abraham was probably losing hope in God at that point in time, that hey, maybe he might not keep to his promise, maybe he has been moody and stuff like that. And I can also imagine a lot of talk about her, oh, how can you get pregnant at this age? And then this idea came to her, maybe when she was taking her bath, that eureka moment that usually come in the bedroom. And she thought to herself, maybe the child wasn't supposed to come from her. Maybe it was supposed to come from someone else. And so she decided to be creative, to come up with this creative idea, thinking outside the box. And so she looked around in her society, the community around her in Canaan, and saw what they were doing. But that's where the challenge usually comes from. When we look around us, when we look at the society and the world around us and what they are doing, and we forget that we are not of the world. Even though we live in the world, Scripture says we are not of the world. We're in the world, we are not of the world. So our standard is not the standard of the world. Our standard is the standard of God. And so Sarah found an alternative solution in our society and decided to apply it instead of waiting for God. And Abraham went along with the plan for whatever reason. Now it seemed like a perfect plan, a perfect solution to help God at that point in time. And I doubt if Abraham prayed. Usually you don't pray in those situations, because deep down, you know that there's something not so clear about it. And there are so many other lessons from this passage, but I want to keep perspective. And so, what was the result? At the end of the day, what happened? Well, at the end of the day, Hagar conceived and she got pregnant just like the plan. And so it looks as though the plan went exactly as they planned it. Everything seems to be going exactly to plan. Hagar conceived and Sarah was happy. But like every shortcut, there's always a hidden cost that is not obvious, not always obvious at the point in time until it's too late. And so Hagar began to despise her mistress because she realized, oh, sure, she's the barren one, that the husband or guy is even okay, is madam. And then she started feeling cool with herself and started disrespecting her mistress, just like we see in our society. And so what happened? What was supposed to be a source of joy became a source of sorrow. Sarah and Abraham started quarreling. And so what should have been a celebration became a time of quarrels. But that's what usually happens when we try to take the shortcut instead of waiting on God. A lot of times we get impatient, and this always leads us to sin most of the times, sins with their consequences. The shortcut always look like a quick solution, to lots of problems at that point in time. You look at, for example, with this pregnancy, my husband will be okay, nobody will laugh at me, everything will be okay. That was what she was thinking of. Typical of us also. Have you ever been deceived, or let me frame it better, have you ever deceived yourself with these get-rich schemes? When, for example, you're asked to invest 50,000 naira and you get a return on investment of 100% or 50%, and it always looks good. Wow, with this investment, I can pay my debt, buy a car, pay school fees. So many things will pass through your mind. It looks like a quick solution to lots of problems. But at the end, you end up losing everything. I've fallen to some of these scams once or twice because of my greed and the fact that I wanted to do it my own way, just as a result of impatience. It's like those drugs. When you enter these big buses, those lower buses in Lagos, I'm sure some of us must have experienced it. Those Nishe drugs, where one drug can cure several things: hepatitis B, AIDS, diabetes, the list goes on, and for just 100 naira. And so always look at, wow, what a cheap solution to all my problems. But what happens? In the end, you end up in a worse situation. It brings more harm to you than good, it makes your situation worse than it was at the beginning. And that's usually the case. We bring a lot of problems on ourselves when we're looking for shortcuts. Just like Sarah and Abraham brought a lot of challenge on themselves because they were looking for shortcuts. Psalm 37, 7-8 tells us, said, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. He said, do not be anxious when you see the evil succeed in their scheme, when they carry out their evil scheme. Say, refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Say, do not fret. It leads only to evil. Anxiety, impatience, all leads to evil and leads to more complications. And what seems to be a solution becomes a more challenging situation. Sarah, Abraham, basically they gave into their anxiety and they fell to the quick fix solution. And at the end of the day, what happened? They ended up in a worse situation. And I know many of us can relate to this. Let me give us some practicals. If you have ever made a mistake in your past, or maybe even right now, you're in one situation that you got into as a result of being anxious, being impatient, and you acted foolishly as a result of not waiting on God, I want you to do two things. First, own up, admit it, take responsibility that you messed up, and take responsibility for it. Secondly, take correction and do what is right. Do whatever needs to be done to put the situation right. That is, do the right thing. And another thing, please share with others around you. Share your experience with others around you so that they don't fall into the same trap and make the same mistake. I tell you, God is able to turn the situation around and make everything work out right because of your right attitude. He can make everything right because he is God. And more importantly, because you have the right attitude. There's nothing that God cannot change if we have the right attitude, because he always looks at the heart. However, the main point we're stressing here is that let us wait on God. Everything will work out when we wait patiently for God, and you will enjoy it. Now, it might take long. I mean, Abraham and Sarah had to wait for 25 years. After the 10 years they messed up, then they had to take correction. They obeyed God, and then they asked Ishmael to go and the mom. And then they waited additional 15 years. But after 25 years, God fulfilled his promise. And their joy knew no bound. And it came without sorrow. And that's how it usually is. When we wait on God, it works out fine. And then we are thankful. And so I really want to encourage us. Let's learn to wait on God. Now, next week we're going to be looking at the second part of this message. And so please, I encourage you to make it a date with me again next week. But until then, stay safe and stay blessed.